One unexpected night of desire pushed our marriage to its breaking point, altering everything forever. I never imagined my life would take such an unforeseen turn. Yet there I was, sitting in our bedroom, staring at the walls, trying to understand how things had spiraled so fast. My husband, Mark, had always been someone who thrived on testing limits, but this was different. The look in his eyes that night, the calm way he spoke, as if it were just another adventure in our marriage, left me utterly speechless. It all started harmlessly, just a conversation that should have been forgotten as quickly as it began. We'd been discussing fantasies, delving into those hidden desires most couples are too afraid to confront. But Mark wasn't like most husbands. His curiosity soon grew into something more. His words echoed in my mind. It's just a thrill, something new, something exciting. At first, I thought he was joking. I laughed it off, but when his gaze darkened, my heart skipped a beat. He wasn't joking, and though I'd never admit it, a small part of me was intrigued. That intrigue quickly turned into unease when he brought it up again, this time with more determination. "You trust me, don't you?" he asked, his voice smooth yet carrying an edge that unsettled me. The question lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. My answer, I realize now, set everything in motion. Before I could fully process it, we were planning something I never would have believed possible. I tried to push the thought away, convincing myself it was just a fantasy, something that would never actually happen. But as the days went by, Mark's persistence grew, his fascination with the idea was becoming all-consuming, and I was left wondering if this was truly about us or something more selfish. The night came faster than I had expected. I was sitting on the edge of our bed, the soft hum of the city outside our window doing little to calm my nerve. I was dressed in a way that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. Mark was pacing the room, checking his phone every few minutes as if waiting for some kind of signal. His excitement was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in my stomach. "What if I say no?" I finally asked, my voice trembling slightly. Mark stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression softening for just a moment. "You won't," he said quietly, and deep down I knew he was right. I had always followed him, trusted him, even when I wasn't sure if I should. But this was different. Yet something in me, a small rebellious part, wanted to see how far I could go, how far we could go together. Before I could say anything else, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. This was it, there was no turning back now. I could feel the tension in air thickening, every second stretching out painfully long. I glanced at Mark, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but he only gave me a knowing smile as he made his way to the door, and that's when they entered. 3 men, towering and intimidating, stepped into our living room. They looked around, eyes scanning the space before finally settling on me. I felt my face flush, heat rising up my neck as I tried to steady my breathing. This wasn't a joke anymore, it wasn't just a fantasy. Mark exchanged a few words with them, laughing and talking as if this was the most natural thing in the world. I stayed frozen in place, unsure of what to do or say. My mind raced with a million thoughts, all colliding and crashing into one another, leaving me in a state of confusion. "Come here," Mark said, his voice softer now, coaxing me toward him. I hesitated for a moment, but then, as if on autopilot, I found myself standing beside him. The men's gazes never left me, their eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place: curiosity, desire, maybe even amusement. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and yet I couldn't pull away. Something had already begun, and there was no stopping it now. The moment I stepped toward Mark, I could feel the atmosphere shift. It wasn't the warm, intimate feeling I was used to when we shared personal moments together, this was something else entirely. The air was thicker, almost stifling, and the weight of 3 sets of eyes on me made my skin crawl. I could sense the intensity of the moment rising, and yet I couldn't back down. My legs carried me forward, even though my mind screamed for me to stop. Mark stood beside me, his hand brushing lightly against mine as if to remind me that he was there, that this was all part of his plan. But his touch didn't soothe me the way it usually did. Instead, it sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't ready for what was coming, but I couldn't pull away now. I had agreed to this no matter how hesitant I felt, and part of me, though I didn't want to admit it, was curious to see where this would go. The three men remained silent, standing just inside the doorway. Their presence was overpowering, each of them radiating a kind of silent authority that filled the room. They were watching me closely, their expressions unreadable, but their eyes told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just about Mark and me anymore. I had become part of something much bigger, something I couldn't control, and the realization left me feeling both vulnerable and strangely exhilarated. Mark cleared his throat, breaking the tension just enough to remind me that he was still in charge. "Why don't we all sit down?" he suggested, his voice calm and confident, as though this was nothing more than a casual gathering of friends, but I knew better. There was nothing casual about this. Every detail, every movement felt deliberate, planned, like pieces falling into place in a carefully constructed puzzle. I didn't respond. My throat felt tight, my words trapped somewhere between fear and uncertainty. Instead, I followed Mark's lead as he guided me to the couch, positioning me between him and one of the men. The others took their seats across from us, their eyes never leaving my face. The silence was deafening. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, shallow and uneven, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Mark leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of the couch, his fingers grazing my shoulder. It was a familiar gesture, one he had done countless times before, but now it felt different. Everything about this situation felt different. One of the men, the tallest of the three, finally broke the silence. His voice was deep and smooth, like velvet. "Is this what you want?" he asked, his gaze steady as he looked directly at me. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Was this what I wanted? I had spent so much time convincing myself that I could handle this, that it was just another adventure, something exciting and new. But now, faced with the reality of it, I wasn't so sure. My mind raced, searching for the right answer, but nothing came. Instead, I felt my stomach churn with a mix of anticipation and dread. Mark answered for me, his voice steady and confident. "He's ready," he said, as if my hesitation was just a minor detail, something to be brushed aside. I glanced at him, hoping for some sign of reassurance, but his expression remained calm, almost detached. This was his fantasy, not mine, and I realized that I had somehow lost control of the situation. And as the weight of what was about to happen settled over me, my heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I tried to steady myself. But the truth was, I wasn't ready. I didn't know how to be ready for something like this. The man beside me shifted closer, his body heat radiating against my skin. His presence was overwhelming, his size and strength a stark contrast to the familiar comfort of Mark's touch. I could feel his gaze on me, intense and unyielding, and it took everything in me not to shrink away. This was happening. There was no turning back. Mark's voice broke through my thoughts, soft but firm. "Remember, you don't have to do anything you don't want to," he said, but his words felt hollow, more of an afterthought than a genuine offer. I knew him well enough to understand that this was about more than just my comfort. This was about pushing boundaries, about testing limits, mine and his. The tension in the room thickened as the seconds ticked by. The men were waiting, watching, their eyes trained on me as if I were the center of some unspoken game. And in a way I was. This was my moment, my decision, even though it didn't feel like it. The weight of their expectation hung heavy in the air, pressing down on me until I felt like I could barely breathe. I shifted uncomfortably, my fingers gripping the edge of the couch as if holding on for dear life. Mark's hand moved to my knee, his touch light but insistent, a silent reminder that he was there, guiding me through this. But instead of comfort, his touch sent a jolt of uncertainty through me. One of the men leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine. "We can stop any time," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Stopping now would mean admitting that I wasn't as brave as I had thought, that I couldn't handle this. And after everything, after agreeing to this, I couldn't back out. Not now. I glanced at Mark, searching for something, anything that would make me feel more grounded, more in control. But his expression remained unreadable, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. He wanted this, he had always wanted this. And so I moved into position. It was happening. The man beside me shifted again, his leg pressing against mine, his presence a constant reminder of what was to come. I could feel the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of my suit, the proximity of his body both thrilling and terrifying. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent as I struggled to make sense of the situation. But before I could say anything, Mark leaned in, his voice low and steady. "You're doing great," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. The words were meant to be reassuring, but instead they felt like a reminder of how far I had come, how far I had let this go. And just like that, the room seemed to close in around me. The walls felt tighter, the air heavier, and I could feel my heart pounding faster with every passing second. The men were watching, waiting, their gazes filled with expectation. And I knew in that moment that there was no turning back. Whatever was going to happen, it was already in motion, and I was powerless to stop it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. Mark's hand moved to my back, his fingers tracing small, deliberate circles against my skin. It was a familiar gesture, one that usually comforted me, but now it felt like a reminder of everything I had agreed to. The man beside me leaned in closer, his voice low and smooth. "You're in control," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "You decide what happens next." But I didn't feel in control. In fact, I had never felt more out of control in my life. My mind was spinning, my heart racing, and every nerve in my body was on high alert. I could feel the weight of their gazes, the intensity of the moment pressing down on me. Mark shifted beside me, his hand moving from my back to my shoulder, pulling me closer. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice soft but firm. "You're safe." Safe. The word echoed in my mind, but it felt hollow. How could I feel safe when everything about this situation felt so foreign, so overwhelming? But I didn't have time to dwell on it. The moment was slipping away, and the weight of their expectation was too heavy to ignore. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming sense of pressure, but even with my eyes closed, I could feel their presence. But the night was far from over. I felt a shift in the air, like everything was on the verge of unfolding, but still paused at the edge. One of the men, the one closest to me, moved slightly, his presence closer than before, and it sent a wave of warmth through my body. His gaze was steady, as if waiting for some kind of signal, a word or a gesture to set things in motion. But no words came, just the unspoken understanding that we were all here for the same reason. The first kiss came unexpectedly, soft and tentative, but it held within it a promise that more was to come. My lips parted, the softness of the moment almost surreal as I let myself fall into the rhythm of it. I wasn't sure if it was fear or excitement that made my heart race, but the moment was too far gone for me to question it now. I felt the presence of the others in the room like shadows, their closeness adding to the complexity of what was happening. There was something about it that felt forbidden, wrong even, but at the same time it pulled me in deeper. It was the kind of kiss that felt like a first step, something that opened the door to everything that would follow. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't forceful, it was deliberate, with just enough restraint to leave me breathless. As the kiss deepened, the air between us thickened, the connection stronger than I had anticipated. There was something almost electric about the way it unfolded, slow but inevitable, like we were both being drawn toward the same unseen force. And then the others joined in. I felt them move closer, the space around me shrinking as the room seemed to fade away. It was just us now, the rest of the world slipping into the background. I felt lips against mine, different this time, firmer, bolder, but still with that same controlled intensity. It was strange how natural it felt, even though every fiber of my being knew this was unlike anything I had experienced before. The kiss deepened, and with it came a shift in the atmosphere. The intimacy between us felt charged now, like every movement was laced with meaning. I could feel the tension between us thickening, building with each passing second until it became something tangible. It was about the way we all fit together in that moment, the way the energy flowed between us, pushing us forward into something neither of us had fully prepared for. My breath quickened, my senses heightened as the moment became more than just a kiss. The presence of the men surrounded me, their closeness enveloping me in a way that felt both overwhelming and thrilling at the same time. I could feel their heat, the weight of their expectation pressing down on me as the kiss became more intense. It wasn't just the physical closeness, it was the way they were watching me, their eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. It was desire, yes, but also something deeper, something that connected us all in a way that I hadn't expected. There was a shift then, a subtle change in the way the room felt, like we had crossed some invisible line. The kiss broke for a moment, leaving me breathless, but before I could catch my breath, another pair of lips found mine. This kiss was different, more urgent, more demanding. It was as if they were all silently communicating with each other, taking turns in a dance that I hadn't realized I'd been invited to. Mark's presence beside me was constant, though he didn't intervene. He simply watched, his gaze following every movement, every kiss, as if this was something he had imagined for years. There was a certain satisfaction in his eyes, a look that told me he was getting exactly what he wanted. And though I had agreed to this, though I had let myself be swept up in his fantasy, there was a part of me that couldn't help but feel like this was more about him than it was about us. But even with that thought lingering in the back of my mind, I couldn't deny the way my body responded. The room felt hotter now, the heat between us building with every touch, every kiss. I felt myself being pulled further into the moment, my mind racing to keep up with the sensations coursing through me. The tension in the room had reached its peak, and there was no turning back now. Another kiss, this one softer but no less intense. I felt a hand brush lightly against my arm, the touch sending a shiver through me as I leaned into it. The men were all around me now, their presence inescapable, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt a strange sense of exhilaration. This was something new, something different, and though I wasn't sure how I would feel about it tomorrow, in this moment it was exactly what I needed. The kisses continued, each one more intimate than the last, until the room felt like it was spinning around us. I could feel the intensity between us building, the air thick with unspoken desire. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, minutes, hours, but it didn't matter. Time seemed to lose all meaning as the intimacy deepened, the connection between us growing stronger with each kiss. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, everything shifted again. The men's touches became more deliberate, their movements more confident as they explored the boundaries of what I was willing to give. I could feel their breath on my skin, their hands brushing lightly against me in ways that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just about the physical closeness anymore, it was about the way they made me feel, the way they looked at me like I was the center of their world. I lost myself in the moment, the sensation of their closeness overwhelming me in the best possible way. It was a whirlwind of kisses, touches, and whispered words that blurred together into one long, continuous moment. My heart raced, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps as I let myself be swept up in the intensity of it all. There was no room for doubt or hesitation now, only the present, only this moment. The intimacy deepened, the connection between us growing stronger with every passing second. It wasn't just about the physical anymore, it was about the way we were all connected, the way our desires and needs intertwined in a way that felt both natural and exhilarating. And just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the moment shifted again. The kisses slowed, the touches became softer, and the intensity that had filled the room began to ease. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, like we had reached the climax of something profound. But even as the moment began to slow, I knew this wasn't the end. There was still more to come, more to explore, and I could feel the anticipation building again even as we caught our breath. The stillness that followed was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't silence exactly, but a kind of quiet that filled the room, a calm after the storm that left the air heavy and charged. My breath came in slow, deep waves, trying to steady myself after everything that had just unfolded. I felt a warmth around me, this strange mixture of comfort and discomfort all at once, as if the very walls of the room were holding the memory of what had happened. The men sat back, not far from where I was, their presence lingering but less overwhelming now. There was no need for words. Everything had been said through the way our bodies had moved together, the way the unspoken agreements had played out. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could finally think. I tried to make sense of how it had all happened, how something that had started as a conversation had turned into this reality, one that I never expected to live through. I leaned back against the couch, letting my body sink into the cushions. My mind drifted back to when this had all started, the moment I had first agreed to entertain the idea. Back then, it had seemed like a far-off possibility, something we could talk about but never actually do. But as I sat there now, the reality of it settling into my bones, I realized just how far we had come from that conversation, and there was no undoing it. The men didn't move much, but they weren't leaving either. It was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the first move, to signal that this was really over. But it didn't feel like it was over, it felt like something had been set in motion that was far from finished. Mark finally broke the silence, his voice low and calm. "Are you okay?" he asked, but there was no worry in his tone. He already knew the answer. He just wanted confirmation. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure if I was. I wasn't hurt, not physically at least, but emotionally, mentally, I wasn't sure where I stood. There was a part of me that felt relieved it was over and yet another part of me that wondered what came next. How do you go back to normal after something like this? How do you pick up the pieces of a marriage when you've crossed a line so far beyond anything you imagined? I looked over at Mark, trying to read his expression. His face was calm, serene even, but I could tell that something had shifted between us. The way he looked at me wasn't the same as it had been before, there was a new layer to it, something darker, more complicated. He had seen me in a way he never had before and I had seen him in a way that I couldn't ignore. "We did it," he finally said, his lips curving into a small, satisfied smile. "You were amazing." I wanted to respond, to say something that would match the moment, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I gave a small nod, unsure of what I was supposed to feel. Was I supposed to feel proud, accomplished, or was I supposed to feel ashamed? The truth was, I didn't know how I felt. I only knew that things would never be the same again. One of the men finally stood up, breaking the strange, suspended moment that had lingered in the room. He stretched, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor as he looked around. The other two followed suit, as if this silent signal had told them it was time to go. They didn't speak much, exchanging only a few quiet words with Mark as they began gathering their things. It was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it almost felt surreal. I watched them move, their presence still large even as they prepared to leave. I wondered what they were thinking, whether this was just another night for them, something they did often, or whether it had meant something more. I doubted I would ever know. The men seemed to exist in a world that was completely separate from mine, a world that I had stepped into, briefly, but didn't belong in. Mark walked them to the door, his voice low as he exchanged final words with them. I could hear snippets of the conversation, thank yous, acknowledgements, words that felt almost too formal for what had just happened, and then, just like that, they were gone. The door clicked shut, leaving Mark and me alone in the stillness of the room. He stood by the door for a moment, his hand resting on the handle as if he wasn't quite ready to face me. When he finally turned, there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. He crossed the room slowly, his movements measured, as if he was trying to gauge my reaction. He sat beside me, not saying anything at first, just watching me. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice soft. I shrugged, unsure how to put it into words. How was I supposed to feel? What was the right emotion after something like this? Mark took my hand in his touch light but insistent. "I know this was a lot," he said, his tone gentler now, "but I'm proud of you. I knew you could handle it." The words hit me harder than I expected. He had always been confident, always pushing me to explore the edges of my comfort zone, but this had been different. This had been about more than just us, more than just an adventure. This had been about pushing the very boundaries of who we were as a couple, and now that we had done it, I wasn't sure where we stood. "Was this enough for you?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Mark's brow furrowed slightly as if the question surprised him. "Enough?" he echoed. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I mean, you've always wanted more, always wanted to push things further. I don't know if this is where it ends for you." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I guess we'll have to figure that out together." I nodded, though his answer didn't give me much comfort. There was something unsettling about the way he said it, as if this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. And maybe it was. Maybe this was just the first step in something that neither of us had fully understood when we started. But now we had crossed that line and there was no going back. We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The room felt different now, quieter, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that came after something irreversible had happened, something that had changed the very fabric of who we were. I didn't know where we would go from here, but I knew that nothing would be the same. Eventually, Mark stood up, breaking the stillness. He stretched, the tension in his body evident as he moved across the room. "We should probably clean up," he said, his tone practical, almost detached. I nodded, standing up slowly, my limbs feeling heavy as I followed his lead. We began straightening the room, the mundane task a strange contrast to everything that had happened. But as we worked in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than either of us had anticipated. As I glanced at Mark, I could see it in his eyes too. This had been a test, a turning point, and now we were left to deal with the aftermath. What that would look like I wasn't sure, but one thing was clear, we couldn't go back to the way things were. We were different now and so was our marriage. What came next was anyone's guess. As the night drew to a close, the quiet hum of the city outside slowly seeped back into focus. The intensity of the evening began to fade, replaced by a sense of quiet resolution. We gathered our things in silence, the weight of what had transpired still lingering in the air, but without the urgency it once held. There was no need for words now, we both understood that the night had left its mark. As we stepped outside and into the cool night air, a sense of calm washed over me. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the world seemed to carry on as if nothing had changed, even though everything felt different to us. We made our way home, side by side, the soft sound of our footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. The walk felt surreal, almost dreamlike, as if we were moving through a space that was both familiar and foreign. I could feel the tension in my body slowly releasing with each step, the events of the night settling into the past. And yet there was a strange sense of connection between us, a silent understanding that whatever lay ahead, we had crossed this threshold together.